AITA for not wanting to split my inheritance with my step-siblings. I, 25F, lost my father after a long battle with cancer. It's been an incredibly hard time for me as my dad and I were always really close. I was his only child and he raised me by himself after my mom passed away when I was young. We had this deep bond and losing him has been devastating. When my dad remarried 7 years ago, I was happy for him. He found love again with my stepmom, Karen, 40F, who had 2 kids of her own, Jake, 19M, and Emily, 16F. I tried to get along with them, even though I was already in college when they came into the picture. My dad and Karen seemed happy and I wanted to support that. My relationship with Karen was always fine, cordial, but we never got that close. As for Jake and Emily, we didn't have much of a sibling bond. They were nice enough, but we lived different lives, and there was never a real connection beyond polite family gatherings. After my dad passed away, I learned that he left me a significant inheritance. He had a will, and in it he explicitly left everything to me, his house, his savings, and some investments. He'd worked hard his whole life, and I think he wanted to make sure I was financially secure. I wasn't surprised by this because we had talked about it before, and he made it clear that he wanted me to have everything. My dad's estate wasn't enormous, but it was enough to ensure I could live comfortably, pay off my student loans, and even think about buying my own home one day. Here's where things get messy. When Karen found out about the will, she was shocked. She said she assumed that my dad's estate would be divided between me, Jake, and Emily, since we were all part of the family now. Jake and Emily both came to me soon after and said they thought it would be fair if we split everything equally, like real siblings. I was blindsided by this. My dad's will was clear, he left everything to me. There wasn't a mention of splitting anything with Jake and Emily, and I know that's what my dad wanted. He never treated them badly, but he always made it clear that I was his only child, and this inheritance was his way of providing for me after he was gone. He wasn't especially close with Jake and Emily, and I think he saw them as Corinne's responsibility, not his. When I told them I didn't want to split the inheritance, all hell broke loose. Corinne said I was being selfish and accused me of trying to cut her and her kids out of the family. Jake and Emily both started sending me texts about how family means sharing, and that I was disrespecting my dad's memory by not including them in the inheritance. I felt like I was being ganged up on, and it hurt because I just wanted to honor what my dad wanted. I tried to explain that this was my dad's decision, not mine, and that it wasn't about money. It was about following his wishes. But Corinne kept pushing, saying that her kids deserved a part of the estate because my dad had been a father figure to them too. She said they were struggling financially and that it would be the right thing to do for me to share what I had inherited. But here's the thing, I don't feel like I owe them anything. My dad wasn't their father. He was my father and he worked hard to build this life for us. He made his choice and I feel like it's not fair for them to pressure me to go against his wishes. Now my relationship with Corinne and my step-siblings is completely shattered. They've been calling me greedy and selfish, and Corinne even said that my dad would be disappointed in me for not sharing. It's gotten to the point where I'm considering cutting off all contact with them, but part of me feels guilty. Am I wrong for wanting to keep the inheritance that my dad left for me? Am I the asshole for not wanting to split it with my step-siblings? Update 1, well, things have gone from bad to worse. After reading some of the responses to my original post, I decided to sit down with Corinne, Jake, and Emily one last time to try to explain my side of things. I thought that if we could have a civil conversation, maybe we could reach some kind of understanding. I wasn't expecting a miracle, but I hoped they might at least see where I was coming from. We met at Corinne's house, and right from the start, the tension was thick. Corinne was cold, barely acknowledging me when I walked in. Jake and Emily sat on the couch, arms crossed, looking like they had already made up their minds. I took a deep breath and tried to explain that this wasn't about greed or selfishness. I told them that my dad's will was clear and I was simply trying to honor his wishes. I reminded them that my dad had worked hard his whole life to provide for me, and this was his way of ensuring I had security after he was gone. Before I could even finish, Corinne interrupted me. She said something that completely floored me. Well, if your dad had known I was pregnant with his child before he died, maybe things would have been different. I was stunned. Pregnant? I had no idea what she was talking about. She went on to say that she had found out she was pregnant just a few weeks before my dad passed away, but she hadn't told anyone yet because she wanted to be sure. She was claiming that she was carrying my dad's child and that this new baby deserved a share of the inheritance too. I felt like the room was spinning. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My dad was gone, and now suddenly Corinne was claiming to be pregnant with his child? It felt like a manipulation, like she was trying to use this situation to guilt me into giving up a portion of the inheritance. I didn't know what to say. Jake and Emily jumped in, saying that if their mom was telling the truth, then there was even more reason for me to share the estate. They started talking about how family sticks together and how this baby would be their sibling too. So it would only be fair to include them all in the inheritance. I didn't know what to believe. Was Karen really pregnant? Was she telling the truth, or was this some twisted ploy to pressure me into giving in? I didn't want to accuse her of lying, but the timing just fell off. I told them I needed time to think and left the house in a daze. I'm more confused than ever now. If Karen is pregnant, does that change everything? Should I be considering the needs of this potential new sibling? Or is this just another attempt to manipulate me into splitting the inheritance? Update 2. A lot has happened since my last update, and things have taken a dramatic turn. First of all, Corinne is indeed pregnant. She showed me the ultrasound pictures as proof, and I can't deny that it's real. She's about 3 months along now, and it's clear that she's carrying my dad's child. I was shocked when I saw the evidence, and for a brief moment I felt guilty for doubting her. But that guilt didn't last long. After confirming the pregnancy, Karen and my step-siblings immediately pushed harder for me to split the inheritance. They were relentless. Corinne started talking about how she needed the money to provide for the baby and how it was only fair for my dad's unborn child to receive a share of his estate. Jake and Emily were even more vocal, accusing me of being heartless and selfish for not immediately agreeing to their demands. It became too much. I was overwhelmed and didn't know what to do, so I decided to speak with a lawyer. I explained the situation to my attorney, and after reviewing my dad's will, she gave me some shocking news. Because my dad's will was clear and written before Corinne's pregnancy, there was no legal obligation for me to share the inheritance with the unborn child or my step-siblings. Legally, everything belonged to me, and unless I chose to give them a share, they had no claim to it. Hearing that brought me some relief, but it didn't make the emotional side of things any easier. Corinne was still pressuring me, and my step-siblings were becoming increasingly hostile. They started posting vague things on social media, making me look like the villain, and I even started getting messages from extended family members who had heard Corinne's side of the story. Everyone seemed to think I was the bad guy for not sharing the inheritance with my new sibling. I decided I couldn't take it anymore. The constant pressure and guilt-tripping were wearing me down, so I made a difficult decision. I cut off contact with Karen, Jake, and Emily. I blocked them on social media, changed my number, told them I wouldn't be discussing the inheritance directly with them, and have contacted a lawyer. I am sorry for ending the update here. Believe me, I wish I could say things ended here, but I have a very long legal process ahead of me. Final update a year later. It's been a while since my last post, and I know many of you have been wondering what happened. I didn't want to update until everything was resolved, but now I can finally share the full story. Buckle up, because it's been a wild ride. After I said I'd be contacting a lawyer, I went through with it. I hired a great attorney to handle the legal mess Corinne had dragged me into. I was ready for a long, drawn-out battle over the inheritance and, of course, the situation with her unborn child. But things took a turn I never could have seen coming. About 3 months into the legal proceedings, my lawyer received some unexpected information from Corinne's legal team. Apparently, they had been keeping something from us that was about to blow the whole case wide open. Corinne had suffered a miscarriage. I was floored. I didn't know what to think. Corinne had never mentioned anything about it to me. She had continued to pressure me about the inheritance, acting as though her pregnancy was still progressing. For months, she allowed me to believe that I was fighting her on this because of the unborn child's right to a share of my father's estate, when in reality, that wasn't the case at all. She had kept the miscarriage hidden and continued using the pregnancy as leverage in the legal battle. At first, I felt a strange mixture of shock and guilt. Miscarriages are devastating, and despite everything that had happened between us, I wouldn't wish that kind of pain on anyone. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. Corinne had used her pregnancy first to emotionally manipulate me into sharing the inheritance. And then, even after the tragedy of her miscarriage, she kept it going, trying to use her grief to strong-arm me into giving her a portion of my father's estate. I confronted her directly. I wasn't sure what kind of reaction I'd get, but I needed answers. When I asked why she hadn't told me about the miscarriage, Karen broke down. She admitted that she'd been afraid of losing her financial security after the baby was no longer a factor in the case. She said she'd been under intense stress with her finances, and she saw the inheritance as the only way out. That's why she had continued with the lawsuit, hoping I would eventually give in or that the court would side with her. I was speechless. This woman, my stepmother, had not only hidden something so tragic from me, but had tried to use it to manipulate me for her own gain. It felt like a final betrayal. After our confrontation, Karen dropped the lawsuit. She didn't have any legal standing to continue, and she knew it. But that wasn't the end of the story. I needed closure, not just with Karen, but with my dad's memory and the life I had been thrown into since his death. I decided to sell my dad's house. It was too full of painful memories, too tied up in the chaos of the past year. Selling it felt like the only way to truly move on. I used part of the money from the sale to pay off my remaining student loans and put the rest into savings and investments, just like my dad would have wanted. As for Karen, I cut off all contact with her and my step-siblings. I knew there was no going back after everything that had happened. They had shown me their true colors, and I realized that I didn't need that kind of toxicity in my life. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was necessary for my own peace of mind. Now, a year later, I'm finally at peace. I've moved into a new apartment, started dating again, and focused on building the kind of life my dad would have been proud of. It hasn't been easy, but I've learned that sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that set you free. I'll always miss my dad, but I know he's with me in spirit. And as for Karen, Jake, and Emily, I wish them no ill will, but I'm done letting them take up space in my life. This chapter is officially closed. Thanks, Reddit, for being there through all of this. Your advice and support helped me navigate one of the toughest years of my life, and I'm forever grateful.
Am I wrong for telling my fiancé I want a prenup, even though he feels it means I don't trust him? I, 29F, have been with my fiancé, Chris, 31M, for 3 years, and we've been engaged for 6 months. He's everything I've ever wanted in a partner, kind, funny, driven, and we share similar values when it comes to life and family. We met through mutual friends, and things progressed naturally. I love him, and I have no doubts about our relationship or our future together, except for one thing, the prenup. I didn't grow up wealthy by any means. My family wasn't dirt poor, but we struggled, especially after my dad lost his job when I was a teenager. My mom worked 2 jobs to support us, and I saw firsthand how financial strain can break a person. That's part of the reason why, when I started making good money, I was very careful about how I spent and saved it. After college, I worked my way up in a marketing firm, and now I'm making 6 figures. I bought a house 2 years ago and have a solid retirement fund growing. I've always been careful to manage my finances responsibly, and I'm proud of how far I've come. I've worked hard for everything I have, and it hasn't been easy. I've seen it happen too many times. My cousin got divorced a couple of years ago, and her ex-husband, who barely worked, took half of everything she'd earned, including a chunk of her inheritance. It was brutal, and it left her in financial ruin for years. She's still recovering, and the whole ordeal shook me. I couldn't stop thinking about how easily everything I've built could be ripped away from me if something similar happened. So, a few weeks ago, I brought up the idea of a prenup to Chris. I tried to be as gentle as possible because I know the subject can be touchy. I told him that I wanted to protect what I'd worked for and that it wasn't about me not trusting him. It was more about safeguarding myself in case things didn't work out. I thought he'd understand. I was wrong. Chris was furious. He immediately accused me of not trusting him and said that the fact I even suggested a prenup meant I was already doubting our future together. He said it was insulting, especially since we've always been open about our finances, and he's never once tried to take advantage of me. He even brought up how we split everything 50-50, and how he's never made me feel like I had to pay for more just because I earned more. I felt terrible. The last thing I wanted was to hurt him, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was something I needed to do. I tried explaining that the prenup was just a precaution, and that it didn't mean I didn't love or trust him. I pointed out that the prenup would protect him too, in case things went wrong. But Chris wasn't having it. He said that if I really loved him, I wouldn't be thinking about divorce before we're even married. He accused me of being too focused on money and said that I was acting like marriage was just a business transaction. He stormed out of the house, and we haven't spoken much since. Every time I try to bring it up, he shuts down or changes the subject. Now I'm stuck. On one hand, I understand why Chris feels hurt, but on the other hand, I feel like I'm doing the responsible thing by protecting myself. I don't want to lose him, but I also don't want to end up in a situation where I'm left with nothing if our marriage falls apart. Am I the asshole for wanting a prenup, even though Chris feels it's a sign I don't trust him? Update. It's been a week since I posted, and a lot has happened. After reading the comments and reflecting on everything, I decided I needed to have a serious conversation with Chris. I couldn't let this prenup issue fester any longer. I love him, but I also needed him to understand where I was coming from. We sat down last night, and I tried again to explain my perspective. I told him about my cousin's divorce and how it left her financially devastated. I told him how I'd worked so hard to build a stable life for myself, and how scared I was of losing it all. I wasn't trying to hurt him or make him feel like I didn't trust him. I just wanted to protect myself, just in case. I thought I'd done a better job of explaining this time, and for a moment, I thought he was starting to see things from my point of view. But then, out of nowhere, he hit me with a question I wasn't expecting. What if I asked you to quit your job after we get married? I was stunned. Quit my job? That's never been part of our plan. We've always been a two-income household, and we've never discussed me quitting work. I asked him why he'd even bring that up, and he said that if I was so focused on protecting my assets, then maybe we should consider a more traditional setup where he works, and I stay home. He said it would even the playing field, and that way, I wouldn't have to worry about him taking my money. I didn't know what to say. The thought of giving up my career was terrifying. I've worked so hard to get where I am, and I couldn't imagine just walking away from it. But Chris seemed dead serious. He said that if I wanted to put conditions on our marriage with a prenup, then he could put conditions on it too. The conversation spiraled from there. I told him that quitting my job wasn't an option, and he accused me of choosing money over our relationship. He said that if I really trusted him, I wouldn't need to cling so tightly to my career or my assets. I told him that I wasn't clinging to anything, I just wanted to protect myself. But he kept pushing, saying that I was too focused on money and that it was clear I didn't trust him. Eventually, I just walked away. I couldn't handle the conversation anymore. It felt like we were going in circles, and no matter what I said, Chris wasn't willing to see things from my side. This morning, I woke up to a long text from him. He said that he loved me, but that he couldn't marry someone who didn't trust him. He said that if I was so focused on protecting my money, then maybe we weren't right for each other after all. He said he needed some space to think, and that he was going to stay with his brother for a while. I don't know what to do. I love Chris, but I also feel like I'm being backed into a corner. I don't want to lose him, but I also don't want to sacrifice everything I've worked for. Right now, I'm just heartbroken and confused. Update 2. I didn't expect to be writing another update, but here I am. A lot has happened in the last month, and I finally feel like I have some closure, even though it wasn't the outcome I wanted. After Chris went to stay with his brother, we didn't talk for almost 2 weeks. I was devastated. I didn't know if our relationship was going to survive, and part of me was starting to question whether the prenup was worth all the pain. Maybe I had been too focused on money. Maybe I should have just trusted Chris and let it go. But every time I thought about it, I kept coming back to the same place. I wasn't asking for a prenup because I didn't love him. I was asking for it because I wanted to protect myself, and I didn't think that was wrong. Then, about a week later, Chris finally called me. He said he wanted to meet and talk things over. I agreed, hoping we could finally reach some sort of resolution. We met at a coffee shop, and things started off civil enough. We both apologized for the way things had escalated, and for a moment, I thought maybe we could work things out. But then Chris dropped a bombshell on me. He talked to his parents about the prenup, and they'd convinced him that if I couldn't trust him enough to marry him without one, then I wasn't the right person for him. I was crushed. I tried to explain, one last time, that it wasn't about trust, it was about being practical. But he wasn't hearing it. He said that his family believed marriage should be about complete trust and that by asking for a prenup, I was proving that I didn't trust him fully. That was it. I realized in that moment that we were never going to see eye to eye on this. No matter how much I loved him, no matter how much I wanted to make things work, I couldn't sacrifice my own security to make him feel better. I told him that if he couldn't understand my need for a prenup, then maybe he was right, we weren't right for each other after all. We broke off the engagement right there. It was quiet, almost surreal, and I remember sitting across from him in that coffee shop, feeling like the world had shifted beneath me. Chris didn't argue. He didn't try to convince me to change my mind. He just sat there, staring at his cup of coffee, nodding like he knew this was the only possible outcome. Afterward, we went our separate ways. No big blowout, no dramatic scene. Just a painful, heartbreaking end to what had once been a promising relationship. For days, I walked around in a daze, wondering if I had made the right choice. Had I let my fear of losing everything ruin the best relationship I'd ever had? Or was it Chris who had let his pride and insecurities drive us apart? I went back and forth, but eventually, I realized that it wasn't just about the prenup. Yes, the prenup had been the spark that ignited the fight, but the real issue ran deeper. It was about trust, but not in the way Chris thought. It was about understanding, compromise, and respecting each other's needs. Chris had made it clear that my desire to protect myself was a deal breaker for him. And in doing so, he'd shown me that he wasn't willing to meet me halfway. A few weeks after the breakup, I started therapy. I needed to talk to someone about everything that had happened, and I wanted to make sure I wasn't carrying any unresolved baggage into future relationships. My therapist helped me see that asking for a prenup didn't make me a bad person. It didn't mean I didn't love Chris or that I didn't trust him. It simply meant that I wanted to protect the life I had built, just in case. And that was okay. In the months that followed, I focused on healing. I threw myself into my work, spent more time with my friends, and took up hobbies I hadn't had time for during my relationship with Chris. It wasn't easy, there were nights when I missed him so much it hurt, but I knew in my heart that we weren't meant to be. Then, about 6 months after the breakup, I got a message from Chris. It was a short, polite note asking if we could meet up to talk. I wasn't sure if I was ready to face him again, but curiosity got the best of me. So, I agreed. We met at the same coffee shop where we'd ended things. As soon as I saw him, I could tell something had changed. He looked more grounded, more at peace. He started by apologizing for how everything had gone down. He admitted that he'd been blindsided by the prenup request and that his initial reaction had been more about his own insecurities than anything else. He said he'd spent a lot of time thinking about what had happened and realized that we had both been right in our own ways. It was a strange conversation, one filled with honesty, regret, and a bit of closure. Chris told me that he wished things had gone differently, but he also admitted that maybe we weren't as compatible as we'd once thought. I agreed. It was bittersweet, but for the first time since the breakup, I felt a sense of peace wash over me. We didn't get back together, and we both knew we wouldn't. Too much had happened, and while there was still love between us, it wasn't enough to overcome the fundamental differences in how we viewed marriage and money. But we parted on good terms, wishing each other well in our future endeavors. It felt like the proper ending to what had been a significant chapter in both of our lives. In the months that followed, I continued to grow and move forward. I started dating again, but this time, I was more careful about finding someone whose values aligned with mine. I didn't want to repeat the same mistakes, and I wasn't going to compromise on things that were important to me. About a year after we ended things, I met someone new. His name is Matt, and from the beginning, our relationship felt different, healthier, more balanced. We talked openly about finances, trust, and what we both wanted out of life. When the topic of marriage eventually came up, I told him about my experience with Chris and how the prenup issue had caused our breakup. To my surprise, Matt was completely understanding. I get it, he said, without hesitation. You've worked hard, and you want to protect yourself. I'd want the same thing if I were in your shoes. It was such a relief to finally be with someone who didn't see my desire for a prenup as a lack of trust or love. Matt saw it for what it was, a practical decision, one that didn't diminish the commitment we were making to each other. He knew that loving someone didn't mean blindly giving up your own sense of security. Looking back, I realized that everything that happened with Chris was a necessary part of my journey. It taught me valuable lessons about relationships, compromise, and standing up for myself. I don't regret asking for a prenup, and I don't regret how things ended. It hurt, but it helped me grow into the person I am today. As for Chris, I heard through mutual friends that he's doing well. He's dating someone new, and I hope he's found the kind of relationship that makes him happy. I wish him nothing but the best. In the end, I've learned that protecting yourself doesn't mean you're not open to love. It just means you're being smart about it. And in a world where so many things can go wrong, there's nothing wrong with being prepared.
Am I the asshole for telling my best friend's girlfriend the truth about why he missed her birthday party? Alright, buckle up, because this one's a mess. I, 28 male, have been best friends with Mike, 29 male, for nearly 20 years. We've been through thick and thin together high school shenanigans, college parties, even helping each other through breakups and crappy jobs. Mike's been like a brother to me. We've always had each other's backs, no matter what. That's why this whole situation is so hard for me to talk about. Mike has been dating his girlfriend, Sarah, 27F, for a little over a year now. I really like her, and honestly, she's been good for him. She's sweet, funny, and has her life together in a way that, to be frank, Mike sometimes doesn't. He's got a bit of a wild streak, nothing crazy, just a tendency to act a little irresponsibly, especially when it comes to drinking and making plans. But Sarah seemed to bring out a more grounded side in him, and I was genuinely happy for them. Until, well, things started going sideways. It all began a few weeks ago. Sarah's birthday was coming up, and she had been planning a small get-together with a few close friends. Nothing too fancy, just dinner, some drinks, and hanging out. She was really excited about it, and I knew she'd been dropping hints to Mike about how much she wanted him to be there. Now, here's the thing. Mike is terrible with dates. Not just in the forget your anniversary way, but more like forget his own birthday kind of way. But Sarah had been reminding him for weeks, so I figured he'd actually show up for her birthday. The day of the party rolls around, and I get a text from Sarah asking if I've heard from Mike. She's worried because it's getting late, and he hasn't shown up yet. I try calling him, but no answer. At this point, I'm thinking maybe something happened at work because he had mentioned a busy week, but I still felt uneasy. I head over to the party, and Sarah looks devastated. She's trying to put on a brave face for her friends, but it's clear she's upset that Mike is nowhere to be found. Then, about an hour into the party, I finally get a text from Mike. It's a group text with our usual guys, and it's a picture of him and the rest of the crew at a bar downtown, laughing and taking shots. I couldn't believe it. He was out drinking with the guys on Sarah's birthday, the same birthday he had promised her he'd make time for. I felt my stomach turn because I knew how crushed she would be when she found out. Now, here's where things get complicated. I figured maybe Mike didn't realize how late it was, or that he'd forgotten about the party. I mean, that would be typical of him. But I still didn't understand why he couldn't at least send a text. When I tried calling him again, he finally picked up, and he was clearly drunk. He said something like, "Oh, I had to stay late at work. Couldn't make it." Then he laughed and hung up. At this point, I had two options: lie for him or tell Sarah the truth. I knew if I lied, she'd probably buy it. Mike had already told her he might have to stay late at work, and I could easily cover for him. But Sarah was standing right there, looking heartbroken, checking her phone every few minutes, hoping he'd at least send a message. I couldn't do it. I couldn't stand there and watch her get her hopes up over something that was never going to happen. So, Against my better judgment, I pulled Sarah aside and told her the truth. I told her Mike wasn't at work. He was out with the guys, and he'd lied to her. She went quiet for a moment, then her face crumpled. She asked me if I was sure, and I showed her the picture Mike had sent us from the bar. She just stared at it, her eyes filling with tears. I felt like the world's biggest asshole, but I couldn't lie to her. She deserved better than that. After that, Sarah excused herself from the party and went home. I stayed for a bit, but I couldn't enjoy myself. All I could think about was the fallout that was coming. I knew Mike was going to be pissed when he found out what I'd done, but I also felt like I did the right thing. I just didn't expect it to blow up as badly as it did. The next morning, Mike called me furious. He said Sarah had confronted him after the party and that she was considering breaking up with him. He accused me of stabbing him in the back and said I had no right to get involved in his relationship. I tried explaining that I couldn't stand there and watch her get hurt, but he wasn't having it. He kept saying that I should have covered for him, like I always had in the past, and that I crossed a line by telling Sarah the truth. That was 2 weeks ago, and Mike still isn't talking to me. Sarah, on the other hand, thanked me for being honest with her, but things are still rocky between them. I don't know if they'll make it through this, and now I'm stuck wondering if I did the right thing or if I should have just kept my mouth shut. So Reddit, am I the asshole for telling my best friend's girlfriend the truth about why he missed her birthday? Update. While things escalated, I've been reading through the comments on my original post, and a lot of you had opinions, some in my favor, some not. But most of the feedback got me thinking about my friendship with Mike and whether I've been enabling his behavior all these years. Honestly, that's been a hard pill to swallow. Maybe I have been covering for him too much. Maybe I should have seen this coming. After sitting with that for a few days, I reached out to Mike again. I sent him a long text, apologizing if I hurt him by telling Sarah the truth, but I also told him that I wasn't sorry for doing what I thought was right. I explained that Sarah didn't deserve to be lied to, and that he needed to take responsibility for his actions. I said that if our friendship meant anything to him, we could have a real conversation about why this all happened, but he needed to stop blaming me for his screw-up. Mike didn't respond to the message right away, but when he did, it wasn't what I expected. He apologized, not just for the way he'd acted recently, but for a lot of things. He admitted that he'd been screwing up for a while, and that this situation made him realize how much he'd been taking both Sarah and me for granted. He told me he'd been acting out because he was feeling trapped. He loved Sarah but wasn't ready to fully commit to the serious direction the relationship was heading in. So, instead of being honest with her about his fears, he started sabotaging things, making excuses to avoid big conversations, and lying about dumb stuff like missing her birthday. Mike said he was embarrassed about how he handled everything and that he needed to get his life together. We met up in person a few days later and talked it out. Really talked for the first time in a long while. It was a tough conversation, but it felt like we were finally being honest with each other. As for Sarah, things between her and Mike are still up in the air. She's been taking some space to figure out what she wants. Mike told me he's giving her the time she needs and that he's working on himself in the meantime. Whether or not they stay together, I don't know. But at least now, they're being more upfront with each other. So, that's where we're at. Mike and I are on better terms, and I think this whole mess might have actually saved our friendship in a weird way. Sometimes doing the right thing isn't easy, and it definitely wasn't in this case, but I think it was worth it in the end. Second update, a month later. Hey everyone, it's been about a month since my last update, and I've been thinking about giving some closure to this whole situation. A lot has changed, and not exactly in the way I expected. I guess that's life though. It has a way of surprising you when you think you've got everything figured out. First, let's talk about Mike and me. To be honest, we're no longer friends. I didn't expect it to go this way, But after that long conversation we had, something shifted between us. We weren't mad at each other anymore, but things just didn't feel the same. We tried hanging out a couple of times after our heart-to-heart, but it was awkward. The easygoing vibe we used to wasn't there anymore, and I realized we were mostly just coasting on our past. I guess the whole birthday drama wasn't just about Sarah or that one night. It was a wake-up call for me too. Over the last few weeks, I've been reflecting on our friendship, and I came to the hard realization that we've been drifting apart for a while. We're not the same people we were when we were younger, and I think I was holding on to this idea of Mike being my ride or die because of all the history we had. But lately, I've been seeing that we were heading in different directions for a long time, and the birthday thing was just the final push. I was still in the group chat with the rest of the guys for a while, but every time I saw their messages about going out or making plans, I felt more and more disconnected. They were mostly talking about bar hopping or random stuff I wasn't really interested in anymore. I didn't realize how much I'd grown out of that scene until I saw it all happening without me. It was weird. These were my friends, my people, for years, and now I felt like an outsider. A couple of weeks ago, I made the decision to leave the group chat. No big announcement, no drama, I just quietly exited. I thought someone might reach out to ask if everything was okay, but no one did. And you know what? I was fine with that. It made me realize that I didn't really fit in there anymore, and that's okay. People grow apart. I'm focusing on other things in my life now: work, family, new friendships. It feels weird to say goodbye to a part of my life that was so central for so long, but I think it was time. Now, for those of you who are wondering about Sarah and Mike, here's the update you've probably been waiting for. After taking some time apart, they had a serious conversation about where their relationship was headed. Mike came clean to Sarah about how he'd been feeling trapped, not just because of the birthday drama, but about everything in their relationship. He admitted he wasn't ready for the level of commitment she was expecting, and that he'd been acting out because of his own fears. Sarah, to her credit, took it better than I expected. I think she appreciated the honesty, even if it hurt. In the end, they decided to break up. It wasn't a dramatic screaming breakup or anything like that. It was more like they both realized they wanted different things, and that it wasn't fair to either of them to keep pretending otherwise. Sarah wanted a future with someone who was as committed as she was, and Mike, for all his good intentions, just wasn't ready to be that person. It was sad, but from what I've heard, they both seemed to be handling it pretty well. Sarah and I talked a couple of times after the breakup, and she told me she's doing okay. She's taken some time for herself and focusing on her own happiness. She said she's grateful for everything she learned from her relationship with Mike, even if it didn't work out in the end. She's a strong person, and I know she'll come out of this just fine. As for Mike, I haven't heard much from him directly, but a mutual friend mentioned that he's been keeping a low profile lately. I think he's taking some time to figure out what he really wants, and honestly, that's probably for the best. As for me, I'm in a good place. Losing a longtime friend like Mike was tough, but I don't regret how things played out. Sometimes, friendships change, and that's part of life. I've been putting more energy into the relationships that matter to me now and reconnecting with people I drifted away from over the years. I'm focusing on myself, figuring out what I want, and for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm moving forward instead of holding on to the past. So yeah, that's the closure to this whole saga. It's not the happy, everything's perfect ending I might have hoped for, but it feels right. Sarah's moving on, Mike's working on himself, and I'm finding my own path too. Life's messy, but sometimes you've got to let go of the things that aren't working anymore to make room for something better. Thanks for all the support, Reddit. Your comments help me see things in a different light. I'm grateful for the clarity they brought. On to the next chapter. Am I the asshole for refusing to attend my dad's wedding because he didn't invite my mom? I know the title sounds ridiculous. Why would anyone want their parents, especially divorced parents, to be together at a wedding? But before you start thinking I'm crazy or just being difficult, let me explain how things got to this point. I, 29M, have had a complicated relationship with both of my parents for most of my life, but especially with my mom. My parents divorced when I was 14, and it wasn't pretty. My mom, Lisa, was controlling, manipulative, and, well, abusive. I spent a lot of time trying to wrap my head around what happened during my childhood. For years, I tried to minimize what she did, convince myself it wasn't that bad, and that maybe I was just being too sensitive. After all, she's my mom, right? But no, it was bad. She's the kind of person who could make you feel like you were worthless in one breath and then act like she was the only person in the world who truly loved you in the next. Growing up, nothing I did was ever good enough. If I brought home a B on a test, she'd ask why it wasn't an A if I got an A. She'd say I was getting cocky and needed to be humbled. I could never win with her, but I always kept trying, hoping for her approval, which, of course, never came. When I was a teenager, my dad, Rob, couldn't take it anymore. They argued all the time, and my mom's emotional abuse wasn't just directed at me. It was aimed at him too. She'd belittle him, mock him for his job, for not making enough money, for everything. Eventually, he packed up and left. I don't blame him for that. He was miserable. But when he left, I was stuck with her. That's when things got worse. Without my dad around to take some of the brunt of her anger, it all fell on me. I was 14, alone with a woman who controlled every aspect of my life. She guilted me into thinking that if I loved her, I wouldn't want to spend time with my dad. If I dared mention wanting to visit him, she'd cry and scream about how I was abandoning her, just like he did. So, I stopped asking. For years, I didn't see my dad much. She had me so twisted up that I honestly believed I was hurting her by wanting a relationship with him. Fast forward to now. I'm 29, and I've been working through a lot of this in therapy for the past few years. I've made some progress, at least enough to set boundaries with my mom and to rebuild a relationship with my dad. It hasn't been easy, but we're in a better place now. He's been with his fiancée, Jenny, for about 5 years, and she's great. She's kind, funny, and genuinely cares about him. When they announced they were getting married, I was happy for him. I thought maybe this time he'll get to have the kind of relationship he deserves. But then came the issue of the guest list. A few weeks ago, my dad and I were talking about the wedding plans, and I asked if my mom would be invited. I wasn't sure if she'd even want to go. Honestly, it seemed unlikely, but it felt like the right thing to do. As messed up as our relationship is, she's still my mom. I figured my dad would at least ask her, for my sake, if nothing else. Instead, he laughed. Why would I invite Lisa? She made my life hell for years. There's no way I want her anywhere near my wedding day. I get where he's coming from, believe me. I lived through that hell with him, but it still stung. It felt like he was completely dismissing the fact that she's my mom. It's not like I wanted them to get back together or even be friends. I just thought it would be a gesture of goodwill. Something to show that, despite everything, we're all still a family in some weird way. I didn't say anything in the moment, but it weighed on me for days. Finally, I called him back and told him how I felt. I told him that I thought he should invite her, not for himself, but for me. I explained that it would mean a lot to me if he could set aside their history just for one day, so we could all be there together. His response was not what I expected. He got angry. He told me that I was being unreasonable, that there was no way he was going to invite that woman to his wedding, and that I needed to get over it. He said that I was acting like a child, letting her manipulate me all over again, and that if I couldn't understand why she wasn't welcome, maybe I shouldn't come either. That hit hard. I tried to explain that this wasn't about me being manipulated. It was about trying to find some way to reconcile the two parts of my life. But he wouldn't listen. He told me that if I felt that strongly about it, maybe it was best if I didn't attend. I didn't know what to say. My dad's wedding is supposed to be a happy occasion, but now it feels like there's this huge divide between us. I don't want to miss it, but I also don't want to feel like I'm betraying my mom by going. And yes, I know she's done terrible things. I know she's hurt me and my dad in ways that are hard to forgive. But she's still my mom. And if I go to this wedding, knowing that she wasn't even considered, it feels like I'm choosing him over her. I've been wrestling with this for weeks, and I still don't know what to do. My therapist says it's okay to set boundaries with both of them, and that I don't have to choose one over the other. But that's easier said than done. If I don't go, I know it'll hurt my dad, and we've only just started rebuilding our relationship. But if I do go, I'm afraid it'll break something inside me that I've been trying to heal for years. To make matters worse, my mom found out about the wedding. She's been calling me non-stop, asking why she wasn't invited, and guilt-tripping me into siding with her. She's telling me that if I go, I'm proving that I don't love her, that I'm choosing him, and that I'm just like my dad, another person abandoning her. I know it's manipulative. I know that. But the thing about growing up with someone like her is that it's hard to stop hearing that voice in the back of your head. The one that tells you you're not enough, that you owe her something for all the years she put up with you. So here I am, stuck between my parents like I've been my whole life, and I have no idea what to do. Reddit, am I the asshole for refusing to go to my dad's wedding because he didn't invite my mom? Or am I just being unreasonable? Update. A lot has happened since my original post, and I figured it was time to give an update. First, I want to say thank you to everyone who commented. It really helped me see things from a different perspective, especially about my relationship with my mom. A lot of you pointed out that I've been stuck in a cycle of trying to please her, and that maybe it's time to break free from that. That was hard to hear, but I needed it. After I posted, I decided to have a serious conversation with my dad. I told him that I didn't want to miss his wedding, but that I was struggling with the whole situation. He actually listened this time, which surprised me. He said he hadn't realized how much I was still affected by everything that happened with my mom, and that he understood why this was so hard for me. He didn't change his mind about inviting her. He was firm on that. But he did apologize for how he'd reacted before. And we had a real heart-to-heart about the years we lost because of her. He admitted that he'd been bitter about the divorce for a long time, and that seeing me still tied to her in some ways brought all that anger back. But he also said that he respected whatever decision I made about the wedding. That conversation helped a lot, but I was still on the fence about going. Then, a few days later, my mom called me again. This time, she wasn't crying or yelling. She was cold, calculating. She told me that if I went to the wedding, I'd be dead to her. She said I'd be no better than my father, a traitor to the family, and that she'd never speak to me again. It was in that moment that something snapped. For years, I've been bending over backward, trying to keep her happy, trying to avoid the guilt and the emotional blackmail. But this time, I didn't feel sad or guilty. I just felt done. I realized that no matter what I did, it was never going to be enough for her. She would always find a way to manipulate me, to make me feel like I owed her something. So, I told her that if that's how she felt, then maybe it was time we went our separate ways. She screamed at me, called me every name in the book, but I didn't care anymore. I hung up the phone, and for the first time in my life, I felt free. I went to my dad's wedding. It was beautiful, and I was happy to be there, to celebrate with him and Jenny. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was choosing something for myself, not because of guilt or obligation, but because I wanted to. As for my mom, I haven't heard from her since. I'm sure she's telling everyone that I abandoned her, but I'm okay with that. I'm done living for her approval. Now, I'm focusing on my own life, my own happiness, and building the relationships that matter to me. Thanks again to everyone who helped me see things more clearly. It's been a tough journey, but I'm finally starting to feel like I'm in control of my own life. Second update. So, here I am again. It's been a few months since my last update, and I thought things had finally settled down after my dad's wedding. But as it turns out, I was wrong. Very, very wrong. I thought cutting my mom out of my life would bring some peace, and for a while, it did. I felt lighter, more in control, and I was finally focusing on my own happiness. But as anyone who's dealt with a manipulative, toxic parent can probably guess, my mom wasn't going to let me go that easily. Part of me was relieved, no. Most of me was relieved that there was a small part that was unsettled by how quiet things had gotten. I knew my mom, and I knew she wasn't the type to just give up that easily. Let me back up a bit. After my dad's wedding, I felt like I was finally free from my mom's grasp. I hadn't spoken to her since that awful phone call where she told me I'd be dead to her if I went to the wedding. At first, I was expecting her to blow up my phone with angry messages or guilt trips, but there was nothing, just silence. For a couple of weeks, I kept waiting for something to happen. Every time my phone buzzed, I braced myself for the inevitable storm, but nothing came. I went about my life, trying to enjoy the peace and focusing on my work, my friends, and rebuilding my relationship with my dad. It was a weird adjustment, honestly, to not have that constant tension hanging over me. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. Then, one morning, I woke up to a knock on my door. It was a Tuesday. Nothing unusual about that. But the moment I opened the door, I knew something was wrong. Standing there was my mom, looking more disheveled than I'd ever seen her. Her eyes were wild, her hair a mess, and she had this frantic energy that immediately set me on edge. "Why haven't you called me?" she said, her voice trembling with anger. "You think you can just walk out of my life like that?" I was shocked. I hadn't spoken to her in months, and here she was, standing on my doorstep as if nothing had changed. I tried to stay calm, but my heart was racing. "Mom, I told you, I needed space. I don't want to do this right now." But she wasn't listening. She pushed her way into my apartment, ranting about how I'd betrayed her, how I was just like my father, and how I'd abandoned her after everything she'd done for me. It was like she was stuck in a loop, repeating the same things over and over, getting louder and more aggressive with each word. I kept trying to reason with her, but it was no use. She wasn't there to talk. She was there to make me feel guilty, to drag me back into her world of control and manipulation. It was like all the progress I'd made, all the boundaries I'd set, didn't matter. In her mind, I still belonged to her, and she wasn't going to let me go without a fight. After what felt like hours of her screaming and accusing me of being the worst son in the world, I finally told her she needed to leave. That's when things escalated. She grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin, and told me that I couldn't cut her out of my life, that I owed her for everything she'd sacrificed for me. It wasn't just emotional manipulation anymore. She was physically trying to keep me there, and it terrified me. I pulled away from her and told her again to leave, my voice shaking. When she refused, I did something I never thought I'd have to do. I called the police. She didn't believe I'd actually do it, but when she saw me on the phone with the dispatcher, her entire demeanor changed. She went from furious to pleading in a matter of seconds, begging me not to humiliate her like this. But I was done. I'd reached my limit. I wasn't going to let her control me anymore. Not like this. The police arrived a few minutes later, and I explained the situation to them. They escorted her out of my apartment, but before she left, she gave me this look, one that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't anger anymore. It was something deeper, more dangerous. She didn't say anything as they led her away, but I knew this wasn't over. For the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching me, I'd see cars parked outside my building that I didn't recognize, and every time my phone rang, I expected it to be her. I blocked her number, blocked her on social media, but somehow she always found a way to get to me. She'd send letters to my apartment, slipping them under the door or leaving them in the mailbox. Each one was more unhinged than the last, filled with accusations, threats, and reminders of how I'd ruined her life. I kept trying to ignore it, hoping she'd eventually give up, but the breaking point came when I found her sitting outside my apartment building late one night. She was just sitting there, staring up at my window, waiting for me. When I confronted her, she started screaming at me in the middle of the street, telling me that I couldn't escape her, that I'd always be her son, no matter what I did. It was terrifying. I realized then that this wasn't just emotional abuse anymore. This was stalking. She wasn't going to stop until she'd completely broken me down, and I couldn't let that happen. That night, I made the decision to take legal action. The next morning, I went to the courthouse and filed for a restraining order. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Despite everything she'd put me through, part of me still felt guilty, like I was betraying her by taking things this far. But I knew I didn't have a choice. She wasn't going to stop unless I made her, and I couldn't live my life in constant fear of when she'd show up next. The process took a few weeks, but eventually, the restraining order was granted. She's not allowed to come near me or contact me in any way. It's been a few weeks since then, and for the first time in months, I feel like I can breathe again. I haven't seen or heard from her since the order went through, and I'm hoping it stays that way. I never imagined things would get to this point. I never thought I'd have to legally separate myself from my own mother, but here we are. It's heartbreaking in so many ways, but it's also freeing. I'm finally starting to rebuild my life without her constant presence looming over me. I know there's still a long road ahead. My therapist says it'll take time to fully heal from the years of manipulation and abuse. But for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm on the right path. I'm learning how to set boundaries, how to prioritize my own well-being, and how to let go of the guilt that's haunted me for so long. Thank you to everyone who's been supportive throughout this entire ordeal. Your comments and advice help me see things more clearly, and I'm grateful for that. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that it's okay to choose yourself, even if that means walking away from the people who are supposed to love you the most. Stay safe, everyone.